Boston. Hello, Alicia, if you're out there. Thanks very much to you indeed. And over those weeks in The Influence, we've spoken to Kevin Barry and Paul Murray and Eilish Ní to Mark O'Connell, to historians and art experts and all kinds of fascinating people. And we've got a lot more to come in this, the rest of this year and coming into the next semester. So I guess I'm saying that Joseph O'Connor, our guest here tonight, is in very good company. Joseph O'Connor is the author of 18 books, including the novels Cowboys and Indians, Redemption Falls, Ghostlight, The Thrill of It All, and Shadow Play of last year. He's written screenplays and short stories and a series of very well-received stage plays. He's got 6 non-fiction collections and hundreds of radio diaries. His novel, Star of the Sea, sold more than 1 million copies and it's been published in 40 languages. Joseph O'Connor, you've won the Irish Pen Award for Outstanding Achievement in Irish Literature. You're awarded an honorary doctorate from the National University of Ireland. You're elected to membership of Ace Dona. Among your other awards are Hennessy Hall of Fame Award for Irish Fiction, France's Prix Millipage, Italy's Premio Acerbi. You're now Frank McCourt Professor and Chair of Creative Writing at the University of Limerick. It goes on and on and on, and it all gets even more wonderful. And before I begin, actually, with you, Joe, if I may, actually, I'd just like to welcome the guests here tonight to post their questions here on the chat. So, Joe O'Connor, thanks so much to be here. And, you know, for being here, I want to begin, if I might, actually, with your early days growing up in South County Dublin, somewhere near Goatstown, I think, indeed. And Dunleary. Was there, I wonder, actually, Joe, was there a particular moment in your, I mean, in your family, in your education, in your environment, or indeed in your reading, when you realized that, yes, I want to be a writer?
Well, first of all, Joe, let me thank you for your very gracious welcome and say hello to my old pal, Mike Cronin, and to everybody who's along tonight. And thank you for the opportunity of being here with you. I grew up in a house where there were a lot of books. Both my parents left school early. My dad left school when he was 13. He's from Francis Street in the Liberties, very proud of his Dublin heritage. And they didn't have much in the way of formal education, either of my parents, but they had a genuine, deep, abiding love of the arts and a genuine respect for all of that patrimony that we in Ireland have. I think they had a very deep sense that this little country on the western outposts of Europe hadn't done everything right, hadn't achieved success in every area. And there was political failure, and there was the north of Ireland, and there was emigration, all of that. But they took pride in the fact that the greatest poet of the 20th century, Yeats, had walked the same streets as us, and that James Joyce had been from Dublin, and Shaw had been from Dalkey, near Dunleary, where I grew up. And they handed that on, certainly to me, with a sense of lightness. I mean, they felt this is not homework. This is something that you can be really proud of. And you should probably know a bit about Wilde and Synge and Lady Gregory, because you'd be a richer person if you did. So as I say, there were hundreds of books in the house. I remember old Poolbeg Press paperbacks of Julia O'Faolain and Frank O'Connor and the great Irish short story writers. And then in the middle of my teens, I started to read a bit more widely and to have that, not hunger, but curiosity, that wondering, could I ever do that myself? And then when I was 17, I read a copy of a great American novel, The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, a great novel of teenage life. And I could probably date it if I thought carefully enough about it, Joe, but I can remember turning the last page of that novel in my bedroom in Arnold Grove, Glenageary, near Dunleary, and thinking, that's what I would like to do with my life. That was the book that finally turned the key for me. And I can remember thinking, I might succeed, I might fail, I don't care. I want to be like J.D. Salinger, I want to be like John McGahern, I want to spend my time trying to do that. And a lovely thing about Ireland, you know, and I've come to really value this as my own career has gone on and as I've traveled to other countries, there really was a sense, and I think there still is among Irish people who are parents, for example, that to have a child who wants to work in the arts is a special thing and a good thing, something you would be proud of. You know, and not everybody feels that. I remember when I was at Oxford, I went to Oxford for a year after UCD, a very nice man who was the master of the college, an American scholar. And the tradition was all of the PhD students would go and have tea with the master once a term. And I went along, we had a chat. He said, so what are you going to do with your life after you leave here? I said, well, I'm hoping to write. And he said, don't you mind that you'll be living out of a can of beans for the rest of your life? And because I was young, of course, I didn't mind. So he thought it a strange thing, but I think a lot of Irish people would think it, you know, an interesting thing and a part of the tapestry of Irish life that is special and worth celebrating. And that if you have a child who wants to make their own minuscule contribution to literature or the arts, you know, that they would be encouraged.
Beautiful, beautiful. And that's a beautiful answer. Thank you thank you very much for that. And you just spoke about your teenage years, and I know that you went to school in Blackrock College, a place that seems to produce a plethora of writers. And I'm thinking of people like Paul Murray and Paul Howard, Kevin Power, indeed Flann O'Brien, if we go back a little bit. Was there something about that education, about that place? Is there something about religious? What is that? How did that all?
I have to say, you know, Blackrock College has been in and out of favour over the years. And my great hero, Sir Bob Geldof of the Boomtown Rats, went to Blackrock College and didn't like it very much. My experience there was largely wonderful. The school is, you know, it exists for the promotion of rugby first, and then Catholicism second, but a rather gentle, inclusive form of Catholicism. And at the same time, they always had a great sense that misfits should be tolerated. People like myself who weren't interested in rugby and who liked to go into town on the bus and look at paintings in the National Gallery, or who liked to listen to punk rock, or who liked writing short stories.
Yes.
Yeah, sure, they're just the hapless poor Egypts. And they I think the priests were baffled by the fact that you didn't love rugby as much as they did. But I never felt anything other than tolerance and gentleness around it. Now, other people's experience of the school would have been different. And certainly we all know of the horror stories that have been too many, that have been legion about Irish schools run by religious orders. I can only tell you that my own experience was that they were generally gentle, rather eccentric, rather worldly men. I mean, a lot of them, it was what used to be called a missionary order. So a lot of these men had lived in South America, had lived in Africa, and had seen stuff that people in South County Dublin hadn't seen. So they had some sense of that. That's all I would say. They weren't political radicals. And they saw the lens, they saw the world obviously through the lens of their religious belief system. But I found them inclusive, rather mild, sometimes very interesting men. I mean, the occasional header, but I remember most of them with enormous affection.
You said political radical. I know that Mike wants to ask you some questions actually about your time as a journalist, but you were a bit of a political radical yourself. And I'm thinking back of those times in the mid-1980s when Ireland, or unusual parts of Ireland, became fascinated almost by the Sandinista movement and by Nicaragua and that. And you were one of those. I think you actually went to Nicaragua.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think for people of my age, I was born in 1963. So I sometimes think for people of my age, Nicaragua was what Spain was to people in the 1930s. but Nicaragua was a place where there had been a revolution.
Right.
There appeared at the time not to have been widespread human rights abuses. There wasn't a policy of execution. The revolution had been a genuine popular front. Women's groups, the church, artists, the trade unions, everybody had been involved in chucking out this brute, Somoza and his regime. And new things were happening there. And they seemed to kind of seep into the new things that were happening in Britain and Ireland. The Clash, a great punk rock band who I loved, had a triple album called Sandinista. Our current president, President Higgins, for whom I have enormous affection and respect, was one of the UN observers of the first free election in Nicaragua. So I always was interested in it. And when we went to the Belfield bar, the university bar, you know, on a Friday night as first years, we would all get drunk and say we would go to Nicaragua one day, with absolutely no intention of going. And then in February 1985, my mother died in a car crash. And whatever way, I mean, grief affects people in different ways. And there was plenty of support offered to me and plenty of friendship and people willing to listen. But the way it affected me, Joe, was I wanted to go somewhere where I didn't know anyone. I wanted to be by myself. I wanted to process what had been a very difficult family situation, somewhere where I wouldn't have to talk to anyone at all. So those two things came together, and she died on February the 10th, 1985, and on the 1st of June, I went to Nicaragua. And it was a very formative experience, and it's so long ago. But I would say I rarely have a week when I don't think about that trip. I dream about it. I remember it with the sort of vivid colours with which we remember youth, and it was a big part of my life. And I wrote a novel about it eventually. My second novel, Desperados, is set in Nicaragua.
Indeed, and that's astonishing. That's astonishing meeting of grief and idealism, the idealism of youth, and a grief that comes too soon, of course, as it always does to everybody. Of course, it had to affect your life. Mike, did you want to ask some questions there? You were wondering about some things.
Yeah, I mean, actually, anybody else, please do type in your questions, and we can answer them as we go along. But obviously, Joe, I mean, the one thing, working as a historian, I first started coming over here in the mid-'80s, and your books were everywhere and your journalism was everywhere. And I found them side-splittingly funny. I find them observant of a country I was entering. But I keep going back to them over the years. In terms, as a historian, trying to understand that journey that Ireland went on, which kind of mirrors the period of your schooling, graduation, return from Nicaragua, etc., that you do journey through pre and post Celtic Tiger.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, where you wrote that wonderful piece about the kind of IDA adverts where we are the young Europeans, but they all emigrate. But later on, you're then dealing with, in a way, some of that kind of crass wealth of the Celtic Tiger years. So, two questions in a way. How did you find that whole experience? As you say, you grew up in a house surrounded by literature and that kind of maybe very powerful but older view of Ireland. And then suddenly, 10, 15 years later, you're in bright, shiny, minted Dublin. But also, how did you also, as a writer, find that experience of just producing that level of journalism, clearly to pay the bills, I presume, but just as learning to be a writer, was it that constant demand for material? Did that kind of push you? Is that the great kind of learning school to be in when you, at some future point, have a novel in your head?
Well, I mean, I loved being a journalist. And I mean, as I was saying to Joe earlier, when I was 17 or 18, I suddenly woke up one morning with this ambition to be a writer. But surprisingly enough, there weren't a lot of role models in Ireland at that time. I mean, it seems really odd now when every town and village in Ireland has its own literary festival. And there are readings in bookstores every night of the week. And the Arts Council does so much for writers and all of that. But I didn't really know of many writers. There was one living Irish writer who was in our hood, the late great Hugh Leonard, and he lived in a spectacular, beautiful house on Vico Road in Dalkey, and he had a Rolls Royce. And I remember once during Bob a Job week, when Boy Scouts go around looking for jobs to do in people's houses, I cleaned Hugh Leonard's Rolls Royce, and I thought, geez, if I become a writer, maybe I will have a Rolls Royce one day. But more realistically, I thought, that's not going to happen. So what would a job be where I could use words? What would a job be where I could write a lot? So in UCD, you know, in the summer of first year and second year, when my buddies would be going off to Europe to make money working in the Volkswagen factory in Germany or working on the buildings in England, I got work at the Sunday Tribune in Dublin, which had then just been formed by Vincent Browne. I worked at McGill magazine, and it was the most extraordinary apprenticeship because I was just a young fella with very wide-eyed about writing and journalism. You'd go into the McGill office, which was in a room over O'Donoghue's pub on Merrion Row, and some of the great writers of our time would be sitting there working. I mean, literally, Colm Tóibín might be in one corner, Fintan O'Toole might be in another. Jean Kerrigan was a regular. Nell McCafferty, whose work I love. People who were just an amazing combination of being brilliant reporters and brilliant writers, and that is very rare. And I loved being around them. And it was a fascinating time to know journalists in Ireland. I could never understand journalists' reputation for sort of alcoholic laziness, because I just found them so hard-working, so determined to get the story out. And I suppose it was the beginnings, Joe, of the notion that the media in Ireland should call power to account. Like when I was a kid, and you'll remember this, Mike, and you'll know this from your scholarship, but the media in Ireland didn't pretend to be objective. I mean, the Irish Press Group was there to promote Fianna Fáil, and the independent papers were there to promote Fine Gael, and that's the way it was. People thought that's probably the way it should be. But when Hibernia and McGill and the Tribune and In Dublin and Hot Press came along, there's this generation of new, very restless journalists who said, no, these are not the stories that need to be told. These are the stories. This is what we're going to do. And to be around that as an 18-year-old kid was just fantastic. And then I must say, in terms of discipline, like every novelist should have an apprenticeship as a journalist, because it means you can't sit around waiting for the muse to come on, you know, knock on your windows. If you're writing a column for a weekly newspaper and it's due on a Wednesday afternoon at 5 o'clock, it better come in at Wednesday afternoon at 5 o'clock or you don't get paid. And it's 1,000 words. So it doesn't matter if you've written 1,200 words of the most beautiful prose since Scott Fitzgerald. Somebody's going to get a scissors, literally in those days, and cut off the last 200. So it's very good for your style. It's very good for your discipline. And it was good to be part of something that felt like a sort of revolution in Ireland. And you know what I'm talking about, Mike, the movement from, say, in 1979, the Pope's visit to Ireland. 1 million people, like a third of the population of the entire state, go to the Papal Mass in the Phoenix Park, to the Ireland of Mary Robinson, the Ireland of gay rights, the Ireland of marriage equality, and to me, the altogether more healthy, outward-looking, at peace with itself, at rest in its own skin Ireland that we have now, for all of its faults and for all of the caveats that all of us would have. I wouldn't swap any of it for the rather frightened, monochrome, forelock-tugging country that I grew up in. So it was to be a writer was a great blessing, and to see that happening and to be able to chronicle part of that.
In the chronicling, though, the one thing I love about your writing, especially those pieces you did for Drive Time and the spoken word pieces you've done, One thing that's amazing is, especially again when I go back to them, is at one level you have this hard undertow of seeing those transitions within Irish society, which are big. Because of your own interest, you also have a global perspective, which is not unique, but it's quite unique. But then always it's the characters. I mean, your observations of Dublin people, the teenage girls and the Lewis and the various other pieces, are just wonderful for capturing those experiences of anybody who lives in the city, but most of us can't write them down. I mean, is that sense of the city of Dublin, the characters you have, your own journeys to the West, etc. Yes, you're working as a journalism, but again, you are honing your craft, as it were, because you seem absolutely enamored with character.
Yeah, well, I love character, and I think it's part of our inheritance as Irish writers and readers. If you look at Joyce, Brendan Behan, all the way up to Roddy Doyle, Lisa McInerney, they tend to be comedians, which is an interesting thing in itself, because I think how Irish writers use comedy is often fascinating in that it's used to unbalance the audience and then to hit the audience with the really tough message. I mean, I think Wilde is such an interesting moralist in that way, in terms of how he uses comedy. But the great thing we inherit from Joyce, or one of the many great things, is what a listener he was. What an amazing ear he had for people's dialogue. And if you read, you can read all of Joyce, as you probably have, Joe, and you find he doesn't abbreviate. He doesn't do that Dublin thing. He doesn't say running down the road, Runnin apostrophe. He writes in beautiful, elegant Dublin, Hiberno English that I can remember my own grandparents speaking in. And it is so full of nuance and music and nobility and rudeness and bawdiness, everything. It's like an entire language. And how fortunate we are that Joyce was there to record that and to pass on the message to all Irish writers, as I try to pass on to my own students at the University of Limerick, where I teach. Listen, listen first. We are creatures of language. Words are sounds before they are anything else. And we all remember that from our childhood. I mean, there's the lovely moment at the start of Portrait of the Artist where Joyce pays homage to that. Once upon a time, there was a moo cow walking down. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's knowing that we respond to those words even before we know what they mean. And to me, it's his greatest bequest to us is to listen. Everything that you need to write about is there. You just need to listen. And people on creative writing courses are told all the time, show, don't tell, and that's important, but they're not told often enough, listen, don't tell, because there is a music and a nuance in everyday Irish speech, as there is in everyday New York speech, as there is in everyday London speech. The music of how everyday people talk is just so rich and so worth listening to, and a wonderful thing for a writer to play with. And we have all of that oral tradition, of course, as well, which Joyce is feeding into and passing on to us. So yeah, so then one day you find yourself on the Lewis, the suburban train in Dublin, and there's a couple of kids talking in the way kids talk now, with that mid-Atlantic thing they do all over the world. And because you're an Irish writer, you're able to go, oh, bingo, the light goes on. That could be something. So we owe Joyce a lot for that.
Thank you. Thanks, Joseph. That's absolutely marvelous. And of course, we owe him so much. And as you say, so much for listening. And I'm really happy that you speak about the oral tradition, to which we often make reference, but to hear it spoken about actually in the particularity with which you speak about. And indeed, you're part of that oral tradition yourself, as so many people know you from hearing you on RT radio and that. And I'd like just to speak actually about the oral tradition. And I've recently been listening to, not reading, but listening to Shadowplay, your wonderful novel that's based on actual characters, as you so frequently do. And they are very particularly Bram Stoker and Sir Henry Irving. And I have to say that I was enthralled by the depiction of these characters, and doubly enthralled, we might speak a little bit later, by the sound of it, actually by the sound of it through Barry McGovern. But I want to go to the character of Sir Henry Irving, with which people out there might not be so familiar, though they will know about Bram Stoker and that. He was an actor of the Victorian era and that. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about him, but maybe a little bit more about how you constructed him, the imagined character that you produced. What was that? How did you do that?
Yeah, so Henry Irving was born John Brodrib, what we would now call from a lower middle class family, drifted into acting. In his youth was quite a good actor, and then appears a bit like Robert Johnson is said to have gone to the crossroads one day and sold his soul to the devil and come back as the greatest blues man of all time. In his early 20s, Irving undergoes this transformation and he becomes a compelling, magnetic and hypnotic performer. There are contemporary accounts of him appearing to change shape on the stage, to be able to hypnotize the audience. I mean, a really phenomenal performer. And he decides that he's going to take theatre from the rather louche atmosphere in which it then lives. I mean, theatre at that time, early Victorian era, is not respectable. People shout, people throw beer bottles, the actors stop and break through the fourth wall, and there's heckling and barracking and all of that. I mean, it must have been so wonderful to be there, and I've tried to put part of that into shadow play. But Irving decides he's going to take this rather scruffy art form and make it respectable. And his sidekick, his great ally in doing this, is he hires this rather quiet, self-effacing, part-time writer from Dublin. He's a clerk. He works in Dublin Castle as a clerk of League Petty Sessions. And they meet one night in Dublin because the clerk does a bit of theatre reviewing. And they become friends. And Bram Stoker, the clerk, goes to London. And for 35 years, he is Irving's right-hand man. And they move theatre from the kind of ragamuffin years into being respectable. Irving becomes the first actor ever to be knighted. There's a statue of Irving to this day on Charing Cross Road in London. Actors still, as you say, Joe, most people wouldn't know about Irving, but actors do, and they still have a great reverence for him, and they still hallow the journey that he brought their craft on to turn it into an art. So it's a fascinating relationship because they signed their letters to each other, eternal love.
Right.
They squabbled, they fought, they described each other to journalists as, closer than it's possible for any two men to be, closer than any two spouses have ever been on the face of the earth. But we don't know if the relationship had a sexual component or even what that would have meant to them. Because I think because Irving and Stoker and their great friend Ellen Terry were actors and artists, I think they had a different sense of sexuality as something that exists like a current, like a kind of broadband that's between us and just on all the time. But it's not actually to do with what people do in bed. That sexuality could be part of a theatrical performance or a conversation or a smile, and that sometimes what's going on in the shadows of backstage, hence, the book is called Shadow Play, that sometimes that's actually more interesting than what's going on in the full glare of the house lights. So just this trio always intrigued me. Bram was a Dubliner, as I am. And I always felt he'd been a little left out. There used to be a poster when I was a kid of like the great Irish writers. It's controversial now, quite rightly, for different reasons. None of the writers is a woman. But Bram doesn't appear on the poster. And there isn't a Bram Stoker street or a Bram Stoker bridge. And, Yeats quite properly had his face on the banknote for a while, fumbling a greasy tail. And we're very good at putting up statues of writers and remembering writers in different kinds of official ways. But Bram just sort of slipped between the cracks. I think he wasn't seen as Irish enough. So his absence to me became a kind of presence. You know, I was really interested in him as a kid for that reason.
You brought him absolutely gorgeously to life, and Henry Irving, that you turned into this most absolutely magnificently colourful, full character that I hugely enjoyed. But I want to step back just a little bit for a second, actually. I mean, in talking about these kind of novels set in the 19th century, which many of your novels are actually, and I'm thinking that if anybody from the Victorian era were to walk into a bookshop tomorrow and to pick up Star of the Sea or one of your Chateau play, indeed, they wouldn't be surprised at it. I mean, you do like the realist novel. And the realist novel of the 19th century, as any students out there who are watching you will know, was in the business, of course, of entertaining us, but really almost above that, it was in the business of, I think, improving us. It set out determinedly to improve us. Do you think that that the modern novel can dare to presume to do such a thing, or your own novel?
No, I mean, when I was younger, I thought that, you know, I thought all the things you're supposed to think when you're younger as an artist. I thought that the purpose of every novel is to change the world.
Right.
And I still sort of think that, but in a different way. I mean, I think the first purpose of a novel is to be beautiful. Right. And that in itself is enough to change the world. And the world is so full of ugliness and hate and division and the desecration of language on a daily basis. I mean, anybody who cares about the English language, when they look at what is done to it by politicians and advertising people trying to persuade us that we need things that we don't need, politicians using words in the 180-degree polar opposite of their meaning, and to divide and kind of dog whistle all the time. That maybe, you know, Evan Boland writing a beautiful, clear 14 lines, you know, that is going to make somebody realize something, to make a light go on in somebody's heart, or a candle go on in somebody's head. Maybe that's a political thing to do as well, just to take the language back. So, I mean, I don't want the books to be about nothing. I mean, that's the age I'm at now. Like, frivolous stuff doesn't interest me anymore. Like, the thrillers I read are John Banville's thrillers, because I think they're thrillers, but they have a bit of heart. You know, they have a bit of something else going on. So I want a book to be about something, but I also want it primarily to be a kind of experience of empathy and beauty. I want to be thrilled. I want to read something that would make me feel the way I felt when I read Joyce as a kid, or when I read Amongst Women for the first time. And whether that is actually ever achieved or not, I don't know, but that's why I'm in it. You know, I want to actually produce something that is beautiful, put a tiny little drop of beauty back into the world. And, you know, a lot of the changes in my life and in how I think about politics and civil society and social change and all of that, you know, those experiences or those enlightenments have been given to me by artists and musicians, from Dylan up to the Sex Pistols. And there's a very noble tradition of that in the arts and in storytelling, you know, of the storyteller saying, well, look, the storyteller pointing to something and leaving the thinking to you. When you listen to Dylan's, you know, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, and the opening lines are a story. William Zanzinger killed poor Hattie Carroll with a cane that he twirled around his diamond ring fingers. Dylan is not telling you what to think about it. You know, he's telling you the story and you do the thinking. And that's what I think artists are for.
Thanks very much. I mean, that's a lovely answer, Joseph. Thank you so much, actually. And it's still, indeed, within the tradition of the realist novel, indeed. And I'm thinking of George Eliot and just a little bit of amelioration, just to offer just slight little bits of change that might open up something in the world. Mike, did you want to add something to that there?
I did. I'll take a question as well, actually. I mean, one thing I think I'm fascinated by is this in the last few works, is just the full dive into the kind of 19th century, into the cultural revival period. And building on that, John McGrath his question was, novels early in your career were contemporary, followed by a string of historical novels, then back to modern times with a thriller to ball, and more recently going back in time again with shadow play. Can you tell us about your process in figuring out what and when you write about?
Yeah, I mean, to me, if I have an idea for a character, then I follow that. I mean, I'm really not interested in novels about themes. I mean, despite having written a novel, Star of the Sea, that appears to be about the Great Irish Famine and emigration, and is about those things. To me, primarily, it's about that set of people in the book. So if characters present themselves to me, or a human dilemma presents itself to me, or a line of dialogue, or a couple having an argument, or a man standing on a 19th century tall ship leaving Liverpool, then I'll kind of follow that, and I write 5,000 words about that, and I try and get some sense of whether that story has legs. And if I think it does, then I follow that, whether it's in the 19th century, whether it's, the thrill of it all is set in Luton, a rather Irish-English town in the 70s and 80s. So I'm always led by the character. That said, I must say, for a writer of my age who was brought up reading Raymond Carver and that group of American writers known as the dirty realists, where everything was very, very spare and very pared down. And it was an era when, if the Irish Times reviewed your short story and said nothing happened in it, that would be a good thing. For a writer raised on that, to dive into the Dickensian world, which I felt I had a right to do with Star of the Sea. It's set in 1847, the year Wuthering Heights comes out, a couple of years after Oliver Twist. So to jump into that sort of Victorian excessiveness around language, I mean, they didn't care. The rules hadn't been fixed yet. If you're a Dickens, you want to have 3 adjectives in a sentence, and you bloody do. I just find such an energy and such a capaciousness in a lot of Victorian fiction. I love the fact that because much of it was written in serial form, there are cliffhangers, and they want you to come back next month and buy the next episode. So I absolutely embraced that with Star of the Sea. I tried to fill Star of the Sea with all of those Victorian tricks, and particularly with the kind of lavishness and lushness of the language. And it was a great relief having, I mean, I love Raymond Carver, but there are a lot of Carver imitators who I don't love as much. And it was just like jumping into a swimming pool full of language. And every time I come back to the Victorian era, like with shadow play, you're just released again into that permission to write using every kind of stop in the cathedral organ of the English language. Like, it would be ridiculous to write the thrill of it all using that kind of set of registers. But if you're writing about the 19th century, you're allowed, and it's just always great fun.
That's lovely. Lavishness and lushness are great words to describe kind of what you're doing there. And for some of us, and again, I'm thinking perhaps the students out there watching in here, we think of the role of the author, or the person himself or herself actually there as being kind of troubled figures dealing with the demons in their lives, actually in some dark area. But I can't think that you actually enjoy writing.
I have good days and bad, Joe. I mean, I enjoy it. I always say to people, including my students, writing as a career is a lot more like being married than it is like falling in love. It's not like when you fall in love, it's fabulous. Everything's great. Everything's exciting. Everything is sexy. There are bells on the hill, and I never heard them ringing. I never heard them at all till there was you. And we should all have that experience a couple of times in our life. But there are days when it's not like that, writing. And there are Monday mornings when you and writing might have a little tiff. You and writing might have a little fallout, the little row. And you might say to writing, God, I'm sorry I ever met you. And writing might say to you, well, I'm sorry as well. And then you kiss and make up, and you hope that over a lifetime, through, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, that it'll work out. And I'm just lucky because I made that commitment to it when I was a kid. I decided when I was a young kid, I'm going to do this for my life. I don't care. I had that wonderful irresponsibility of youth, and I'm lucky that it worked out. So, I mean, shadow play, I must say, was a pleasure to work on. It was exciting. I hadn't written a novel for 3 or 4 years. I felt I had technical kind of mastery of the shape of the book. The voices were just a lot of fun to put together. I really knew what I was doing, and I enjoyed pretty much every minute of that book. But it doesn't always happen.
I'd like to stick with shadow play for a few moments because I said earlier, and we spoke about the oral tradition out of which so many of your works come, and which you yourself have embraced, I've said, actually, in the life that you lead, in the voice, in the singular voice that so many people actually in Ireland recognize as you, even if they don't know your face, even if they've read your books, that particular voice comes through, indeed. The book Shadow Play appeared as an audiobook, and perhaps others did, and that's the one that I listened to. What do you think of this? Nowadays, here we are in COVID, and many people find themselves actually walking around listening perhaps more than ever to novels. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that taking from...
I wish everyone well with how they experience writing, and I am somebody who spent 4.5 years writing once a week for the radio, and I loved writing for the radio, and I loved the intimacy and the connection of that. You can tell if you write an article for the Irish Times, you can tell which friends of yours you're going to meet during the week who will have seen it, and the same is true of the Limerick Leader or the Sunday Independent or the Guardian or the New York Times, but you can never tell with the radio. The radio is on in people's car on the way home from work. Somebody's making the dinner, the radio is on. They're in the doctor's surgery and the radio is on in the background. And it had a fantastic rush for a writer that you'd write a piece on the Wednesday morning, record it Wednesday at lunchtime. It would be broadcast on RTE at 4:30 that day. And before my 3 or 4 minutes was finished, the responses would be coming in from the readers. Usually good, thankfully, but they let you know bloody quickly if they don't like it. So I love the voice, and I think if people want to listen to novels, that's great. It's not for me. I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's how I was taught or whatever. I like the look of the words on the page. I think you miss so much when you go to a poetry reading, for example. I think Larkin used to say, you don't even know how long the poem is when you're at a poetry reading. I like the choices the writer has made around the white space and punctuation and all of that. But audiobooks are a fact of life. They're here with us. So when the publishers asked to do shadow play, I said, well, that's great. Could I have Barry McGovern? Because he's such a wonderful actor, because he's so meticulous. He's worked with Beckett. Anybody who's ever seen Barry's one-man Beckett shows or his appearances in the Beckett plays knows what a compelling actor he is. So we sent the book off to Barry McGovern. He said yes. And there was a Saturday afternoon when he was preparing to do a show at the Pavilion Theatre in Dunleary, just down the road from where I live. And he said, so would you come around to my dressing room on the Saturday afternoon? I just want to talk through the book. So it was a memorable conversation because the book had been published, it had been edited, proofread. I had corrected it. My editors had corrected it. The book is actually at the printers. Barry McGovern goes, you see that on page 7? I think that comma's in the wrong place.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
You see that on page 72, that quotation from Shakespeare, it's a semicolon, not a dash. And he had about 11 tiny changes, which I respectfully listened to, thinking I was humoring him. And he couldn't possibly be right about all of them. And on Monday, I sent them to the publishers, and he was right about every single one of them.
Right.
So just the level of engagement with text, his extraordinary meticulousness as an actor, his great knowledge of Irving. I mean, he loves Irving, and Barry knows like what shows Irving did in particular years. He's a wonderful historian of the theatre. We were saying, I think before the conversation started, that he might be a great guest for you to have, and he would be.
He absolutely would be.
But I mean, I love his reading of the novel. I've had a lot of letters about it from people. I gave a copy of it to my own stepmother, who doesn't read much, but she completely loved Shadow Play, and I thinks of it as being by Barry McGovern, and I don't want her thinking that, because he brought so much to it. He's a wonderful man.
That's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, very great. Actually, Mike. Yeah. Because I want to. You're muted there, Mike. So yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, if people, obviously, we're kind of running into the last 15 minutes. If people want to ask questions, and we can throw it open. But while you're typing, I was just intrigued again. I mean, going back to this idea of the 19th century, Star of the Sea, Shadowland, etc., etc. What it is about the kind of the 19th century? I mean, how much of that does that flow from kind of growing up in and around kind of the south side of Dublin's coast, which in itself is very Victorian? Obviously, did the MA in Anglo-Irish literature, which has a huge kind of Victorian era component to it. What is it about that particular period that draws you? But I think also the one thing I do know about the way you work is you're not somebody who goes at this lightly. I mean, you are a kind of archive library junkie, but you are somebody who goes and sits there and digs and digs and digs, that you're not going to propose or put forward a character that isn't entirely kind of historically credible. So I'm just intrigued again about that kind of where that's come from in your life, that you're not kind of just spinning stories and great characters.
It's no, I want it to be
historically correct.
I want it to be right. Yeah, I want the research to be done. I want it to be right. It's not much harder to get it right. It's 10% more work, and it's worth doing, because the reader will always know when it's right. It's mysterious, but the reader will suss out very quickly if it's right. Fiction needs to have authority, and it's related to the word author. So the author has to have done the work. You have to know that the ship going from Cove to New York will take a certain amount of time. I had the sea charts for the 1840s on the wall of my office as I wrote Star of the Sea. I had literally plotted out the latitude and longitude of the ship for every day of that voyage. And, that's not all going to go into the book, but it kind of seeps in by a sort of osmosis. So I want the research to be done, and I want it to be right. I think where it comes from, Mike, is, I loved history in school. I had very good history teachers. I studied history in UCD and was just so fortunate. Like Hugh Goff was my tutor in first year, and Ronan Fanning was there, and Michael Laffin was there. It was just a great history department. But it's actually much more intimate. It's that when we were kids growing up in the south side of Dublin, and everyone was interested in England. Everyone was very focused on England, and all the lads supported English football teams. Everybody supported Liverpool or Chelsea, and we all had relations in England. And the comics were like the Victor, the comic book version of English history of the Second World War, all of that. We listened to English bands. And once a year, my dad would take us to Connemara, to a house that he had started going to when he was 7. And my dad is 82 now, and he still keeps in touch with the family in that house in Connemara. So we used to feel spuriously, perhaps, that there was some connection with those people. And I just loved going there. And at that time, to drive from Dublin to Connemara was like going to another country. It was 5 hours, like through every little town in the Midlands, and the cattle being brought to market. And you'd get to Connemara, the great handsomeness and warmth of the people, and the fact of hearing Gaelic genuinely spoken every day of the week, and the strangeness of it and the beauty of the landscape. And they talked about this thing, the famine, with a sort of recency, as though this had happened about 3 months ago. Now, nobody in Dublin, in my orbit, ever talked about this. But this family, the Costellos, would, and they would point out features of the landscape that seemed to be telling a story. There is a deserted village. There is a mass grave. And the people who lived in that house went to Boston. And the people who lived in that one went to New Hampshire. And this entire life that seemed to have started in the 19th century in this offshore island, it seemed, of Connemara, known as the United States. I mean, they really, that cliche about Boston being the next parish was true. And they never talked about Dublin. They never talked about your relations who might be in Liverpool. America was this living, breathing presence that was also an absence. And it all went back to the 19th century, to this catastrophe, this ground zero that had happened in these fields. You know, you look out at that sea, look out at that coastline, that's the last thing those people saw. And it just went into my soul in some way, and I wanted to know more about it and read everything that I could about it when researching the novel, because there is so much literature about the Irish famine, you couldn't read all of it. I just, the filter I used was that I would read every first person account of it that I could find. So whether it was Asenath Nicholson, reports by the Quaker missionaries who went into the famine areas, letters from landlords' families, which are sometimes very nuanced, and quite a range of depictions of people who they would have described as the peasantry, what they were like, reports in the Times, in the Illustrated London News. Anything that had I in it, I read. But I think that's where it comes from, Mike. It's just, that's what I did as a kid in the summer times, was go to Connemara, and it still has that effect on me. I was there about 6 weeks ago with my wife and our youngest son, and it still is just a very special place. There's nowhere quite like it. You go out to the Aran Islands, still in 2020. It has a touch of the awesome lonesomeness that Synge describes in his book, often in very playful ways. Synge has a lovely story about when he would leave the islands every year, he would ask the family what present they wanted when he would come back next year. And he's leaving one year, and the young boy of the family, the 10 or 11-year-old boy, asked, could he have an alarm clock? So the next year, Synge comes back with the alarm clock. And the islanders all say there was never time here until Mr. Synge brought the clock. In the same way that they said there was never any crime here until the police station opened. And there's just a touch of, you know, what Dylan calls desolation row, when you get out there into that particular part of Ireland. And I think I never would have written Star of the Sea if it hadn't been for those summers.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for reminding us just of what an important part of the Irish experience is the fact and how of the West and of Connemara and how it has filled our imagination and how it expresses itself. And I've got a series of questions coming in from people here in the audience. Thank you very much. But even before we do that, I just want to ask you one quick question, and then going back actually to us talking about Irish secondary schools and about education by religious people and that. And there was one particular figure that I know that you picked out of the past, a Cork man, a young man called Hugh O'Flaherty, who was educated by Jesuits. I'd never heard of him before. Can you tell us something briefly about Hugh O'Flaherty?
Yeah, well, the first thing I can tell you is he wouldn't like being described as a Corkman because he's from Carrizoline, County Kerry.
He would hate it then, wouldn't he?
Yeah, Hugh O'Flaherty is an interesting man. He was born near the end of the 19th century. He became a priest late in life, as they used to say. I can remember my own grandmother saying somebody had a late vocation. Hugh was in his late 20s. Very gifted guy intellectually. He attained 3 doctorates in the course of his life. He spoke 8 or 9 languages. He was a Vatican civil servant. He studied in Rome as a young seminarian, worked in the United States, worked in the Caribbean, and was called back to the Vatican in the 30s. And around that time, the Vatican became officially an independent state through an agreement between Mussolini and the papacy. And people who've been to Rome will know the Vatican is still, it has its own army and its own post offices and all of that. So Hugh O'Flaherty from Kerry is working there, just getting on with his life as a priest. And the war begins and the Nazis invade Italy. And the Nazis are in Rome, but not allowed into the Vatican because the Vatican is a neutral country. And despite being from Kerry and despite being brought up around the Black and Tans, Anglophobia, all of that, he begins to smuggle escaped Allied prisoners across the border into the Vatican and hides them in dozens first, and then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. He endangered his own life. The fact that he was a priest would not have saved him. The ruthless Rome Gestapo murdered at least 2 priests in the course of the year and a half of the Nazi occupation of Rome. He was an absolute pain in the ass to the Nazis. He rescued perhaps 7,000 people, mainly prisoners, but some Roman Jews. Was a great guy for disguises and plots and smuggling in money, and powerful friends that he used to help him in this. And it has aspects of a thriller, but at the heart of it, just to me, a great Irish quality. I'm not doing that. I am not going to obey. Non serviam, as Joyce quoted. Everybody wanted him to stop. The Pope told him to stop. The Irish government told him to stop because the Republic of Ireland obviously is a neutral country. They don't want to jeopardize anything diplomatically. And he just has this wonderful Kerry Irish stubbornness. I won't stop. I don't care what's going to happen. I'm going to save as many of these people as I possibly can. And then at the end of it, his very cruel oppressor, the Nazi leader of Rome called Kepler, is imprisoned. Quite rightly, deservedly, after the war, serves time in his prison in Italy, and nobody visits him because everyone has such contempt for him. But Monsignor O'Flaherty visits him once a month, and they chat and they play chess. And finally, Kepler is baptized into the Catholic Church by Monsignor O'Flaherty.
Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. I mean, the stuff of
that. It's a good story. He was a great man.
Marvelous. And that's going to be your next novel. That's what you're working on.
Yes, I've written 60,000 words of it. And
that's so exciting. That's about as great a kind of a story as one can imagine. And in your hands, it's going to be wonderful. But we can't just quite finish yet because there are a couple of questions here. Elizabeth writes in to say that she writes about Molly Allgood and loved, of course, Ghost Light, as we did. And she wonders how you got her voice so right. And I suppose the question is, how you take on women's voices and actually and make them real.
I don't think you get any points for that at all. I think being able to write is being able to write. You need to be able to write about another gender, another age. Again, Joyce is able to write as a child. It's actually one of the wonderful things about Leopold Bloom. His great curiosity as he wanders through Dublin that day. He imagines what's it like to be a blind person? What's it like to be a woman? What's it like to be a kid? And then in the wonderful soliloquy from Molly at the end, gender becomes very fluid, as it often does in Joyce. So that's just one of the things you have to learn to do. I got Molly's voice by thinking about my my own aunts who were from the Liberties of Dublin. Molly is from the north inner city, so you know, fierce rivalry across the Liffey. But I just tried to remember what my aunts and my grandmother sounded like, and I put that into Molly's voice.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And I see Paul O'Dear, who's always with us, actually wonders about Francis Street and if that influenced your writing. His own people actually come from James's Street.
Yeah.
And it's only in later life that he's got involved in this past, like us all, actually. I think so frequently, though it's only later on that we begin to see how important were those early days.
No, well, I think for my dad, certainly was always very important, still is. He still has a very great connection with Francis Street Christian Brothers School, where he went to school. I had a lovely occasion there myself about 2 years ago. The school celebrated its, I think it was its 150th anniversary, and they invited my dad, but he was away. He couldn't go, and I went on his behalf, and I gave a reading. And President Higgins was there, and there were no cameras, there was no television, there were no reporters. But the president was just so fantastic with these kids, some of whom are new Irish people. Their parents are from different parts of the globe. And then some of the kids have a great grow for the Irish language. The president was just flipping in and out of Irish with them. And I can tell you what it would have meant to my grandparents for a president of Ireland to visit the school that their sons went to. It was just so touching. So it was very important to my dad to have that heritage. All Liberties people think they are the aristocrats of Dublin. And
there's surely are.
And I'm very proud to have had that in my own past.
Thanks, Joseph. I mean, that's a lovely little moment to finish on, actually, just thinking about the past, the people who have gone before you, actually, and our current president, who we love so much. And just before I finish, I'm just going to turn over to Mike to remind us actually about what's coming up next week, please, actually, in the Irish Influence.
Sure, next week, we're going to a centenary, for those of you who know or don't know. A week Saturday is a centenary 100th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday at Croke Park, where British and Irish British auxiliary forces attacked a football crowd and killed 14 people, but it followed on from a whole day of killing, sadly, in Dublin. But part and parcel of the brutality of the broader kind of war of independence of Irish Revolution. So what we're going to do next week is we've got a wonderful author, a journalist guy called Mick Bowley, who's written the book on the events of Bloody Sunday, The Bloody Field. The historian Will Murphy, great historian of the Revolution, who's going to kind of unpack it and put it into a much broader context for us. And then also a Canadian scholar who's working in the UK at the minute, a woman called Heather Deacher, who is going to kind of unpack the story further and put the events of Bloody Sunday into a kind of global context. So that's next week, same time, same place. Bloody Sunday, 1920, the Irish Revolution in a global context. But for now, Joseph O'Connor, sir, thank you very, very much.
It's a great pleasure, Mike. And
wonderful.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Joe, as well. And thanks to everybody.